Three things are guaranteed in life: death, taxes, and Avatar: The Last Airbender discourse. Nostalgia is this super powerful drug that has us returning time and time again to our childhoods. For some people, that results in an endless examination of the art that filled their youth. Relatable. How many reevaluations of Harry Potter and Twilight have you seen? And they're great, aren't they? A good amount of people remain obsessed with Pokemon, as they should be. Nostalgia gets a bad rap these days, in that when anyone brings it up, it's to talk about how it traps us. That does happen. I mean, such an intense focus on the things we consumed when we were younger keeps our bellies full, and we can't vor anything new into our souls. It's not great. At the same time, I don't think there's anything really wrong with examining the things that are important to us and the media that shaped us growing up. That nostalgia can be a bad thing doesn't necessarily mean that it always is. So because of that, we never stop talking about the Nickelodeon fantasy adventure cartoon Avatar: The Last Airbender. You know, it makes sense. Discourse tends to be like the Avatar cycle, an unending samsara that only sort of changes. It's tempting to say it came up recently because of the new Netflix live action adaptation. I haven't seen it, I don't know what it's like. And yeah, partially. It did add new discussions about what the live action was doing, animation versus live action, what it means to want to adultify children's art in the first place, talking about adaptation in general. Do you have to stick true to the source material? Can you use it to inspire you? But the recurring discourse I'm interested in started before the adaptation. The never-ending conversation I want to talk about is the claim that Avatar is bad, liberal propaganda. That's right. Let's talk about violence. See those guns? Book 1, Icebergs and Oceans. Before we get into people's critiques of the shows and my critiques of their critiques, I know I'm so cool. I want to defend the critiquers for a moment. Inevitably, anytime you find someone reading a text under a microscope, someone's gonna come along to scoff. There are no cells there. What you are doing is useless. Because it's useless, I'm going to laugh at you. I find that slightly upsetting that every time we have these in-depth conversations about children's media, someone has to insist that it is not that deep, guys. That's pretty much the go-to way of dismissing analysis in general. I most often see it when it's deployed against queering and other styles of analysis of that vein, but it's not an attitude reserved for centrists or conservatives. Every now and then you'll get a more leftist-leaning person asserting something along similar lines. Think about the film The Menu. When people were making fun of it, which is fine, make fun of whatever the hell you want, they claimed that it was a shallow, haha, eat the witch, literally type of film. Capitalist capture of the revolution. I sincerely disagree with that assessment. That's not what that film was saying. Or you have the dismissals of Hamilton that don't actually engage with the theatrical conventions the musical deploys and exists within. But those at least engage on some form with analysis, even if they regularly dismiss anyone reading any deeper into certain elements than they do. This attitude of it's not that deep is more clearly seen when talking about pop culture. I talked about this when I went over how people dehumanize Taylor Swift. People get really mad when you suggest you shouldn't do that. There are people who assert that Taylor's music is indicative of someone without an inner self and is enjoyed by mindless fans who also are without inner selves, mindless drones. That's not an intellectual statement, it isn't analysis, it's not valid critique. It's trying to moralize your specific tastes and dehumanize anyone who has different tastes. Sorry, that's actively anti-art and anti-intellectual. It's a what if we called people NPCs fascism type thing, but from the left. In other words, it's nonsense that doesn't deserve respect. When people deep dive into children's media, they're often told, it's for kids? That statement is meant to say that the art can't be analyzed. Think of people who insist that English classes in grade school shouldn't assign any contemporary age-appropriate reading. No YA. Insisting that if it isn't within proven classics, it isn't worth anything. And academic context, but that's not intellectualism, and it's not defending the idea of learning. It's the rejection of it. If you assume that you can't apply analytical tools to every text in existence, then you don't believe in analysis. You believe in correct answers for art, and art that is worthy of having correct answers. To that, I can only say grow up. There's no such thing as high art. There's no such thing as objective taste. Everything can be analyzed, and there is no correct answer. There are answers that are more or less supported by the text. Insert a rant here about how we shouldn't be forcing a Shakespeare play every single year instead of including a wider variety of work that has, contemporary theater. It's for kids, for these people, is synonymous with it's not that deep. Art is not a hole where you dig to a certain point and you run into an amorphous layer of lava that's going to destroy you and burst out the hole like a femboy at an anime convention. Art also isn't the iceberg meme with the what you see, what there really is, uh-oh, conspiracy time. Analysis does not exist for the goal of finding the avatar in the iceberg. It isn't going to save you by presenting objective truth. That doesn't exist. Texts are not holes or ice. What are they? The ocean, a vast expanse that you can stay far away from, fly above, float on top, and dive into. You can swim down and down until there is nothing else. There's no light, no life, no heat. You arrive at the all-encompassing. There are monsters down here. Mysteries of gods, worlds lost yet to be. The YA existential tragedy novel They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera is a pretty obvious example of YA fiction ripe for analysis. A world in which death is known and notifications are sent out by an uncaring set of office workers is a bit of an absurd setting, so you get to talk about the philosophies of existentialism and absurdism. You get to discuss mortality and meaning. You can discuss sexuality, homophobia, race, gender. What does it even mean to live? What is a life well lived? If you knew for certain that you were dying today, what would you do? It's a common question that's worth asking. Speaking of Taylor Swift, lyrics can be dissected as poetry, even nonsense lyrics. How do they use meter and rhyme? Is there assonance, metaphor? In the published lyrics, where are the line breaks and how can those change readings? You can talk about wordplay. Video games, much to the chagrin of nose glarers everywhere, are art. You can do a deep dive on Ratchet & Clank, violence, heroes, sentience, racism, war, and how media narratives intersect with politics and popular action. Twilight has a lot to say about desire. Thanks, ContraPoints. Harry Potter has a lot to say about morality. Thanks, Sean. The Hunger Games has a lot to say about spectacle and propaganda. Naruto is about war and the cycles of violence. Superhero movies are often also about war and justice. What is it? How do you get there? The answer to the question, is Avatar that deep, is everything is. Book 2. The complaints. Okay, that out of the way. What are the critiques of Avatar: The Last Airbender that I want to talk about today? The childishness? No. The physics, I am incapable of caring less about physics in fiction. They don't matter. That the ending might be a tad rushed? No. That Suki needed to be in more episodes? I mean, she did, but no. Broadly, I want to talk about those critiques aimed at the ideas of revolution. In this case, when I say revolution, I don't simply mean a radical change in society like you might accomplish through strident democratic reforms or a stranglehold on the art world pushing propaganda. No, we're talking about violent political revolution, direct action, the core of Avatar's plot, and the element I see the most aggravating disdain for. What specifically then? Capital punishment, violence at large, and the systems that exist when the war is over. Capital punishment. Right before the final battle against the big bad Fire Lord Ozai, Aang has a moment of severe moral crisis. Now that the final battle is actually within reach, the gang confronts him with one simple fact. Aang is going to have to kill the Fire Lord. Not defeat him, not imprison him, kill him. Ozai is violent, manipulative. He's a skilled political actor with lots of powerful people in his country at his beck and call. His firebending abilities are nearly unmatched in the history of the art form. The people of his country revere him. If Aang defeats him and then imprisons him, he'll break out. He'll find a way back to power of some sort. The war will only pause. It will not stop. Factions will do everything they can to put him back into power, to fulfill his duty as the Avatar, to stop the war, to free the world, to bring back some type of balance. Aang's gonna have to kill him. Gank that bitch. Aang desperately searches for a way around this. It goes against everything he's been taught that he believes. Life is sacred for him. Air nomads are not supposed to go around offing people, and he's the last one left. If he betrays the values of his people, those values kinda die. So he doesn't want to do it. Aang flies off on his own. He convenes with the other avatars. Roku laments how if he had just killed Sozin, none of this would have happened. Useless as always. Cold-blooded gangster Kyoshi is like, yeah, murder that bitch, I would. I did. And if I'm possessing you, girl, we're going on a little murder spree. Yes. Kuruk, soon condemned to torture by Zelda war crimes, was like, a worm stole my girlfriend's face. Good luck! No, but basically he was saying he has to make big choices about the world. Then comes Avatar Yangshin. She says, I understand. She knows his gentleness and the morals that he was raised to have. She knows why he hesitates. And she says that your soul is sacrificed to the world. Your morals are not more important than the needs of the world. The implication of their words is clear. He has to kill Ozai. Now, some people argue that's not the only interpretation of their words. If you look past the surrounding context and at what they explicitly say after, this is my wisdom for you, none of those wisdoms directly go on about doing a murder. Because I don't hold the view that killing is appropriate and don't think Aang should have killed Ozai, I went Googling around for a better presentation of the argument. Comic Book Resources has a wild listicle going over 5 reasons he should and shouldn't have killed the Fire Lord. They go with the death penalty mainstay, he deserved it. There's the whole, Roku didn't kill a Fire Lord, and that's how we ended up in this mess, so do it. The former avatars told him he had to, and obviously, you gotta do what they say. It was the only route to guaranteed victory. And their number one reason, killing him, would give Aang revenge for what was done to his people. Now, I didn't find that article particularly adept, so let's keep going. Another not so great article comes from Fandom Wire. It argues that Aang should have killed Ozai because Ozai got rid of Zuko to make sure Azula became Fire Lord? Of all the reasons. YouTuber Zero Calistar Zero has a video called Why Aang Should Have Killed Ozai, where she states that morally, taking the bending away was the right thing to do. She instead argues that it would have been the best route for Aang's character arc to have him kill Ozai. After all, one of his main character flaws, she says, is how he runs away from his duties and the sacrifices required of the Avatar. He tries to outrun destiny and it blows up in his face. To have him actively choose to kill Ozai, even with the option of energy bending, would show that he has fully embraced his role in the world and the difficult sacrifices of the soul who has to make in order to embrace it. YouTuber Monkfruit also argues Aang should have killed Ozai based on the same character arc understanding. After establishing that he hates the whole lion turtle deus ex machina and thinks the show should have killed Ozai instead of taking that route, he lays out a few other ideas. His first is that of retributive justice. Given all the harm Ozai has committed, since he is the Voldemort, he deserves death, because that would be the proper punishment. Aang should have killed Ozai because otherwise, Ozai would have killed him. There's the Batman should kill villains argument going on. When a Twitter user asked people for their unpopular opinions on Aang, one person stated they believe the choice to have him struggle with the decision and to then choose energy bending is a choice not on Aang's part about murder, but on the writer's part to demonize violent resistance. Another claimed the show's supposed embrace of nonviolence was holier than thou, that did long-term damage to the audience's politics. He clarified in responses that part of what contributes to him thinking that was Ozai wasn't killed. Eternal dumbass Suki's mom over on Twitter quote tweeted it and said, of course, that was the case because it's bourgeois media. In other words, if it was proper, moral, working class art, Aang would have ganked the dude. I want to expand on some of these arguments a little bit. Consider consequentialism. The moral worth of an action is weighed in the consequences of it. Killing Ozai would prevent him from killing more people. It would save lives. That is a good consequence, therefore it is a good action. Not killing him allows him to potentially do that. If he does, that would make it a wrong action. Consider utilitarianism. The right actions are those that result in a net gain of human good over human suffering. Killing Ozai would be murder and cause the suffering of one man. Yes, immense suffering for him. It would cause Aang to suffer as well for betraying his ideals and people. On a symbolic level, it would also be surrendering the remnants of a destroyed culture to the ways of war. It would be the last action in the Fire Nation's destruction of the air nomads. But doing so does take down the head of a genocidal empire before he can commit crimes against humanity on still living humans. If Ozai lived and continued his rampage, there would be more suffering. Therefore, killing him would be a moral good. If Ozai lived and was imprisoned without the energy bending thing, the immediate destruction would stop, but you would be at constant risk of him breaking free and getting back to his fun war crimes game. Or perhaps his allies would continuously attempt to break him out. Perhaps as their figurehead is still alive, they would cause a civil war. A constant anxiety would loom over the freed parts of the world, thinking that perhaps the master firebender will return and hurt them once more. That suffering is probably weightier than the suffering Ozai and Aang would experience from him going from the Phoenix King to the Ashes King. You can make a meta argument that not killing Ozai teaches kids that when you're presented with an impossible choice, if you simply hold your nose and close your eyes, cross your arms, God will come right out of the ether and finally offer you a third option. Typically, the binary options presented are kill Ozai or he kills a bunch of people. That's not necessarily true, but let's accept that as the binary, and the lion turtle as the deus ex machina miracle. Well, you could be uncharitable and show how that teaching does pop up in politics. In the United States system, you're often really only offered one of two choices. You can elect this dude or this dude. There are a handful of leftists who see the choice of Joe Biden, who agrees with some of their policies, and Donald Trump, a disgusting person with disgusting policies that agree with none of what they want and would harm far, far more people, and they say, I don't want to pick either one, so I won't. This is very moral of me. Surely a third mystical good thing will result because of this. Vote for Biden. Ozai is a mass murderer who oversees colonization, torture, imprisonment, theft, murder, and so on. If you believe in the death penalty, then he deserves it. You can come to that position because you're a utilitarian or consequentialist, or you might just believe in karma and retributive justice. The point of punishment is not to make the future better. The point of punishment is to punish. It is to inflict harm on those who have done harm. And if you believe that, then he should have killed Ozai. And not killing Ozai is a moral strike against him and the show. Violence. Several of the people who find issue with Aang not killing Ozai framed it in a more general critique of how the show approaches the entire concept of violence. Avatar: The Last Airbender had huge issues with holier-than-thou non-violence. I think there are approximately 5 things people bring up when they show disdain for Avatar's handling of violence. You got Aang not killing Ozai, Katara's moment with the man who killed her mom, the redemption arcs for Zuko and Iroh both, the character of Jet, and the character of Hama. We already went over Ozai. As a contrast to that, you see Katara seek revenge against the man who killed her mother. Aang encourages her to forgive him, and that does not sit well with Katara. So she takes Zuko on a little field trip, and they go on an assassination mission. Assassination classroom. When they find the man, well, he's just kind of turned into a pathetic old guy. Despite her immense anger and desire for revenge, Katara kind of decides he's too pathetic to kill. Doing it's not gonna fix her. It'd be a waste. She doesn't forgive him by any means. In a way, it's this moment that provides a blueprint for Aang with Ozai. There's not forgiveness, but the kids don't choose to turn themselves into murderers. This moment with Katara doesn't get as much flack though as with Aang and Ozai for a couple of reasons. The first is part of why Katara doesn't carry it out. The dude's pathetic. He doesn't present the same risk of harm that Ozai does, so there's less to gain by killing him. Some of those same arguments in the past section don't work here. The second is that Katara doesn't whine about not wanting to gank him. She'll bloodbend the bitch. She was considering turning into Marie from Gen Z. Pop, 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 pop. She doesn't deny the idea of vengeance or violence because she doesn't believe in them. She does, quite clearly. She carries the anger these people want to see, the anger that fuels their own desire for blood. Now with Iroh's redemption, he's a war criminal. He committed heavy sins in his past. Instead of burning down the world to repair that, he chose to focus on saving one person, his nephew. Only when those seeds were planted inside Zuko does he betray the Fire Nation. Does that erase the pain he brought down on Ba Sing Se? No, Zuko goes around causing pain and suffering as the prince of an imperial nation. He attacks innocent people and brings suffering down upon them from his entitlement and view that other nations are lesser than he is. He helps in the near death of Aang, but then he has a change of heart. Helps bring down his father, and suddenly he's allowed to be the new Fire Lord without any consequences, supposedly a good ruler now, despite all that he's done. Does helping to overthrow his father suddenly fix all of the damage caused by Zuko? Is the show saying that a few acts of goodness are enough to erase countless acts of violence? Where's the justice for all of the people he harmed? More importantly, does the show believe in good and bad violence, or is it, as that tweeter said, wholly non-violent? People seem that's the case, based on how they talk about Hama and Jet. The whole, it's just all non-violent. If you think Hama was evil, you did not turn on your critical thinking skills. The Fire Nation captured, imprisoned, tortured, and dehumanized Hama, a member of the Southern Water Tribe. Eventually, she discovered that on nights of the full moon, she could bend the blood in any creature and therefore control them. It's this greatly creepy, I love it, ability that grants her freedom, but she can't return home. She's deep in Fire Nation territory, aging, traumatized, and likely she's got some POW torture-inflicted disabilities, so she does what she can. Hama uses her bloodbending on local Fire Nation members. She imprisons them in the mountain where they can be treated as the animal she once was, and as her pet mice. They can hurt no other people in the world. They cannot make more of her. Her experience as a prisoner led her to violent actions. Hurt people, as they say. Or, as one tweet says, Hama was not a villain and was not in the wrong for her actions, and people don't take time to really understand the pain and what the Fire Nation put her through. A post in the leftist Avatar The Last Airbender subreddit, someone posted a meme saying Hama was right while critiquing the gang for causing her to get imprisoned by the Fire Nation for her actions. And the comments when someone brings up that, she was maybe doing a little bit of torture on civilians, you get a somewhat common media criticism that it's a choice liberal writers make in order to villainize otherwise righteous, violent actors, and a way to make sure that audiences don't start developing class consciousness and go out and do a totally successful, totally coming violent revolution thing. It's a twofold criticism. The first is that adding a layer to Hama where she harms innocents is an anti-revolutionary, anti-violence, liberal bad take by the writers. The second is that the gang leading to her re-imprisonment is forcing the victim of horrible atrocities to live out the rest of her days, potentially being subjected once again to those atrocities. A lot of people talk about how Hama was sympathetic, even if her actions were wrong. She witnessed the deaths of her people, her friends. She suffered immensely. And when she finally made it out, her rightful rage consumed her. That's tragedy. Others think she was just right. A popular account said, "Can we talk about Hama, the bloodbending indigenous elder who gets presented as a terrifying villain and literally demonized for her ingenuity and fighting spirit? Avatar The Last Airbender was supposed to be anti-imperialist, but was neoliberal as fuck." As they clarified in a quote tweet, Hama was right and ain't deserved to be arrested for fighting back against imperialism or the genocide of her people. Decolonization is not a metaphor. Lapis Go Blue asked the question, was Hama really a bad person? During which he says, her motives were actually kind of similar to Team Avatar, to get back at the Fire Nation for all that they've done. He doesn't agree with her taking out her anger on the civilians of the Fire Nation, but at the same time, he gets it. Hama's rage is understandable. Her desire to strike back at the Fire Nation is a form of justice. YouTuber Sage's Reign doesn't say that Hama is necessarily right for what she does, but he does go deep into how the Fire Nation treated her. She sees her culture being destroyed. She's in near solitary confinement. That's a thing that's gonna break you. The only way she achieves freedom is through stealing it from others. That's gonna warp how your brain functions even more, of course. Hama's outcome is the logical outcome of what was done to her. She has been subjected to the worst. What good is morality when you are fighting against those who have none? When she forcibly teaches Katara bloodbending, yes, he argues, it is cruel, but in her mind, it's necessary. Katara is a child. Despite Katara's traumas, she has not been subject to the worst dark places of the world. Through gifting her this new trauma, Hama gives Katara the chance to not go through what Hama did if things end up going south for Team Avatar. In a darker adaptation, Katara would likely at some point get captured and nearly tortured, much the same way Hama would. And in using bloodbending to save herself, the audience would find a new gray-colored respect for Hama, a deeper understanding and sympathy for her. That doesn't necessarily mean that they would agree with her actions, but you'd get it. Now, admittedly, for those last two videos, those aren't necessarily the creators critiquing the show. They're more exploring the character and how audiences react to her appearance in the text. But that sympathy they have for Hama is part of the core that drives the other critiques. You must have sympathy for her in order to believe that what she did was right. To argue that Team Avatar should have adapted something close to her methods, to argue that it is neoliberalism that stops the show from embracing her actions. That framework of painting this deadly and effective resistance fighter as evil is liberal politics drives a lot of the criticism aimed at the show's handling of Jet. as well. Jet is an Earth Kingdom orphan and resistance fighter. Before his death, he meets the gang and uses them to attack a local Fire Nation colony. They broke a dam and fled the town. If it weren't for Sokka, they would have killed a lot of people. In a video titled Avatar: The Last Airbender's Colonial Problem, Why Jet Was Right, YouTuber Marxism Culturalism is like, well, of course, the gang are against flooding the town and killing the settlers, their kids. They don't understand that that would be a good thing. They haven't read enough beast theory. Sorry, okay, taking the idea seriously. The civilians are actively part of a settler colonial project. They likely chose to move out to the colonies. The old people will likely want soldiers. Soldiers do also live there. He argues that any kids caught in the crosshairs wouldn't be victims of Jet, but victims of the violence perpetuated by their parents. Jet's strategy of thorough destruction, he argues, is the practical way of defeating colonialism. The gang, he says, should recruit him, or rather get recruited by him and continue with his methods, destroying colony after colony instead of going after some supposed big bad, like killing Ozai would somehow fix all the problems of the world. That's a childish way of looking at issues. It's the Harry Potter issue of pointing out all these inequities of the wizarding world, defeating Voldemort, not changing the wizarding world, and then being like, okay, all's good because my scar doesn't hurt anymore. Yay. Marxism Culturalism calls this villainization of Jet very liberal, very cowardly. So to him, Jet's actions here are strategic. They make sense from a resistance fanon sort of view, but not everyone who critiques the show's handling of Jet as a liberal wet dream agrees there. There's a long post in the Avatar subreddit where someone is like, why did he do that? Why did he do that, Mr. Plain? Over and over with the conclusion that, well, he did that because when liberal writers make a villain with a good point, you gotta have them kick a puppy to show that they're the bad guy. And that way no one gets any ideas. Here, it isn't that he's a freedom fighter maligned by a bunch of idealist kids. Instead, it's that he should be an effective freedom fighter that instead does pointless bad stuff because the writers are anti-violence pansies who don't understand colonialism. They even provide a helpful fanon quote at the end of their post. Colonialism is not a thinking machine nor a body endowed with reasoning faculties. It is a violence in its natural state, and it will only yield when confronted with greater violence. As we all know, disagreeing with a writer is a mortal sin, so not being fanon or how to blow up a pipeline makes the show anti-violence and childish. As the Daily Aang Twitter account says, my biggest problem with Avatar: The Last Airbender is how it depicted colonized people as villains for using violence against settlers. Characters like Jet and Hama get horrible treatment for fighting back the oppressing nation. I don't know what voice that was, but it was kind of fun. But they go on to point that this only deepened as an issue because of how the show treats characters like Iroh, a man who has done vast evils and still gets to work for his redemption instead of being shunted off to prison or killed like Jet. I broke my long-running winning streak of never watching Vosh because there was a YouTube clip of him discussing this very tweet. Though he doesn't seem to have any issue with Avatar: The Last Airbender in this way and goes on to talk positively about how the show ended up handling issues such as this, he points out a common lane of criticism here. It's a trope, the revolutionary who goes too far. You've got these two, Lelouch from Code Geass, that dude in the wind section of Tales of Arise, apparently people from Bioshock, I don't know, I've never played it and don't plan to. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, haven't seen it, but apparently. The Last of Us TV show. 3 things I've not seen or played, but Daenerys gone on a bit of an insane tangent in Game of Thrones. President Coin from the Hunger Games. A lot of the antagonists in Shinsekai Yori, and Pain and Obito from Naruto. The Quincy in Bleach, sort of. It's a common enough trope that I'm sure you can fill up the comments section with more examples, and you totally should. Feed me that engagement, Seymour. More, feed me. The argument deployed against this trope is that it inspires complacency. By overflowing the libraries with them, we tell ourselves that we may only work within the systems we have already imagined, the systems that are currently in place, no matter how awful those systems are. They call it neoliberal because the main concern is not necessarily with human rights, health, or joy, but rather the upholding of systems and status quo. You make a revolutionary who has a point. They have legitimate grievances against whatever system that it is they're rebelling against. And then you have them kick a puppy. They do something comically evil designed purely to rip away audience sympathy. And don't you see? The strength of their conviction about X led them to Y atrocity. Daenerys was too radical in her anti-slavery stance, you guys, so of course she was going to decide to burn up a bunch of innocent people. Nagato was too obsessed with the idea of peace, so of course he became Pain. Propping up such pieces lets people play into their wants to LARP as heroes and then gives them an out. Don't actually act on your convictions, don't actually change things, don't use violence against the violent, that's how you become evil. Alternatively, it confirms that they're right to sit in their complacency, to let the oppressive systems that uphold their lives continue while they hurt other people. Jet placed an attack on a colony. If you interpret settler colonialism to mean that no settlers can be civilians, viewing them all as violent occupiers and thereby combatants, they become valid targets. Flooding the town would not have killed innocents. It would have killed colonizers and proven that Jet's tactics can easily strike back at the Fire Nation. The violence of the oppressors forces the violence of the oppressed. In that measure, Hama and Jet can only be considered consequences of the Fire Nation's actions. Even if their acts are extreme, nothing else could be expected of them. Their anger is rational. And because we can understand that anger, because we can rationalize it, that means we have to validate its expression. Otherwise, we're just doing feel-good thoughts and prayers-esque politics, duh. Imagine the ludicrousness of asking someone to condemn Hama. Sure, Hama might have taken theoretically innocent hostages, tortured them, and ended up inflicting trauma on one of her own people. But critiquing Hama while being against the genocide perpetuated on her people by the Fire Nation is the ultimate both-sidesism. Hama is the only resistance the water. It's a bit on the nose, ain't it? Oops. Well, let's talk about oppression and specifically how Avatar handles systems of oppression. Systems. For the most part, we've been talking about individuals here. Sure, the death penalty is a political tool employed by many belief systems, and in the US, for instance, it's made by and for specific systemic structures. But we only really explore it through individuals. The Fire Lord wants Aang dead. Zhao wants the moon dead. The gang wants the Fire Lord dead. When we get into critiques of violence, one way or the other, we're almost always zooming in on Jet and Hama because they personify the points both the show and its critics are making. But we need to zoom out. At the start of the series, the Fire Nation is a genocidal war machine bent on taking over the rest of the world and spreading their amazing culture, you guys. They're run by the Fire Lord, an emperor. By the end of the series, we find they're oppressive at home as well as abroad. We defeat the Fire Lord, and we replace him with a good Fire Lord. Wait. Is monarchy a good ending? Ba Sing Se is run by a shadow government and secret police. When they and the Fire Nation are defeated, we replace that with, apparently, a monarchy. There are those who can use magic, and those who can't. Benders are often the ones in power because might makes right. They underestimate and often belittle non-benders. Amongst the magic users exists a sort of living nuke. If you get the living nuke on your side, well, if nuclear weapons exist, Best to be on the side that's got one than on the side that don't got one. The nuke might go off and destroy the warmongering empire. Oh. The Fire Nation's Japan? Oh. I don't really want to think of that. As the unfortunate importance of AI and gaming the SEO system continues, getting useful results from Google has become a bit more difficult. But thankfully, when Googling around for this script, it sent me to a Princess Weeks video. It's called Empire and Imperialism in Children's Cartoons, a super light topic. No, she doesn't transform into a superhero made out of photons called Super Light. Yes, that is a very bad joke, not remotely funny, but I'm gonna make it anyway. In it, she discusses how various cartoons handle revolutions and empires. We get Avatar, Star vs. the Forces of Evil, She-Ra, and Steven Universe. I've only seen one of those things, but it was cool to listen all the way through anyway. After praising the show for confronting the brutality of Empire, Weeks brings up the Fire Lord replaced with the good Fire Lord thing. She starts talking about events in the comics. I've not read them, so I'm just kind of assuming she's being accurate here. Basically, what do you do with the colonized land and the people living there? You could just sort of kick the fire people out, hand everything back over. Yes, there are fire peeps who've never lived anywhere else. Yes, there are fire earth kids who are like, "Are you going to destroy our families? Where do we go?" Apparently, the big solution that the comics comes to with this, and the one that Weeks finds frustrating, is, let's shout. Weeks argues that if those fire people want to stay there, they need to do some form of reparations, even if, yes, they were merely born there and didn't actively set out to be part of a colonial project themselves. I'm assuming that would continue on into future generations, or at least through the current babies from when the war ended. Justice in the Avatar world, based on my understanding of her breakdown of the comics, is sort of a kumbaya hand-holding forgiveness thing. You swallow down the wounds and you try to move forward. But what does it mean to move forward? How do you let the wounds of the past turn into scars rather than let them become ever-festering gashes? In a critique of the show and its politics, you could say that that's asking for the oppressed to carry yet another burden. They're not allowed to go back to what they had before, to punish, to get revenge. They're supposed to forgive and adapt to a new system. Forgiveness is a wonderful power in the world, but it's not an easy one. Is it even often a necessary one? I saw an interview between Jeanette McCurdy and Drew Barrymore while Jeanette was on that promotional book tour for I'm Glad My Mom Died. She talks about how part of what made it difficult to heal was her near obsession with the idea that she was supposed to forgive her mom, that forgiveness is what would be good and moral, and so therefore help her move forward in her life. She only made her next step, it seemed, in the healing process when the suggestion was made to her that maybe she doesn't have to forgive. Obsessing over forgiveness, searching for it, can be another way of festering those wounds. When that's the case, forcing that on the oppressed is almost another way of continually wounding them. I'm sure there are more complaints people can make about the show from the left. There's an obsession with spiritualism, though it also contains a sort of rejection of it. The world building revolves around a cosmic individualism, which goes against some leftist views on how that's a bad thing definitionally, though there's also sort of a rejection of that in the show. There's the whole bending is determined by genetics thing, is a sort of magical race science. Aang winning through a series of Deus Ex Machinas could be interpreted as a sort of disbelief in the power of humanity and how we might need cosmic intervention to save us, which could be taken as a religious doomerism. I haven't really given my opinions on these critiques so far, and I think it's about time I do so. Yo. Like, comment, subscribe, do the YouTube shit. Join me over on Patreon. We can talk about art and buy my poetry collection, Butterfly Snuff. It is up on Amazon now, paperback, hardback, ebook, and I'm working on a new one and a bunch of other projects because I'm always making a bunch of stuff. Okay, see ya later. Book 3, The Morality of Violence. The complaints I'm most concerned with regarding the show are those centered around how it handles violence. More broadly, I want to discuss what these arguments mean for violence more generally and how it gets portrayed in art and people's obsession with the idea that art being bad or giving a message that disagrees means it must be censored. Before we can talk about Jet, Hama, and resistance, we need to talk about the violence of capital punishment and murder. Another constant discourse that trends online, specifically on Twitter, surrounds a form of anarchism that answers, what happens when you abolish prisons with, we do some lynchings. One of the ones I saw around the time of writing the script went on about how most crimes can have accidental cases, and voluntary manslaughter is an entire category of killing under most penal systems. It is still illegal, still immoral, but it's easy to see how you can rehabilitate someone who committed manslaughter. The one crime these people always single out as evil beyond redemption that no one could ever rehabilitate from is rape. Their conclusion then is that rapists should be killed. When you see these viral, let's do some communal killings, they focus their ire not on murderers or war criminals or those who commit financial crimes. They specifically call out rapists. These, they say, are the people who must die. It's not something that can be done accidentally. Now, if you're operating under the idea that it's a crime that requires criminal intent, sure. If you're thinking of it as an action, then as unfortunate as it is to think about, there are extreme cases where it can be accidental. Regardless, often the prescribed solution here is that the community should gather them up, or the loved ones of the victim should, and then the victim gets to choose what happens, and if they say die, die. Now, I've got problems with this. I've personally been assaulted a few times. I'm not going to go into it. I understand pain and how it messes with you. It is vile for someone to take that pain and use it as an excuse to stir up their own fantasies of bloodlust. Do I want any of the men who did that to me to die? No. Do I want their blood to be shoved onto my hands via peer pressure of, this is how we protect the community? No. And how dare you? How dare you try to make murderers out of people because of violent retribution is your sexual fantasy? Here's a question that plenty of others have posed these bloodthirsters that they just refuse to answer. How many fewer assaults are going to be reported when people think doing so is consigning someone to death? The vast majority of violent crimes are perpetuated by people who know the victim. It's one thing to protect yourself by attempting to send the person you love who has harmed you to prison. It's an entirely different psychological load to send them to their death or to even kill them yourself. Now, you may say there are plenty now that go unreported due to the messed up, often ineffective justice system and how it handles them, and you are correct. But when you change it to a death penalty enforced not by a court system burdened by evidence and procedure, but instead by the community, you've taken away the ability to talk to your community. I don't want them to die, and so now this must remain a secret of my own until my grave. How dare you? But the effects of their proposed policy do not matter. They don't care how it's going to negatively affect victims. They roll their eyes at warnings of Emmett Till. When you say, hey, there is a trend on the right of accusing queer people of being rapists just for existing, they say nothing. When you bring up revenge cycles and the history of blood feuds, they say you just don't get it. All of this is deflection. They don't answer any of those concerns because they don't care about any of those concerns. The crime of sexual assault doesn't even matter to them. It's just a pretense. They want the fantasy of heavy violence. They want support for their bloodlust, uncritical support at that. They want to kill people, and that's all there is to it. When it comes to debates about the death penalty, I find that a lot of the arguments tend to be bells and whistles. The evidence does not support the death penalty. The logic of allowing a government to kill its civilians through a flawed justice system that is most definitely, provably killed innocents does not properly flow. The morality of employing a person to commit murders is non-existent. So why do people argue for the death penalty? Because they like the idea of killing the bad guy. They want the right people to harm. They yearn to draw blood. You might say that's an unfair reading from me. You might say, but I only want to hurt the bad guys. Hi, you God? Capable of only hurting bad people? How do you find bad? What line does someone lose the right to live? Who earns the right to commit murder? The death penalty has no right to exist. A truly civilized society would do away with it. Baby's first Batman critique is, if he just killed the Joker, Gotham would be safer. Except, here's the thing, vigilante murder squads are, well, bad. That's why it's Baby's first Batman critique, because it is a critique had by those first going to media analysis and critique. Or it's held by edgy big boys whose takeaway from the boys is edgy. The broad left position in the United States leans toward the abolition of the death penalty. That is the morally correct position, by the way. There is no crime worthy of death. Much like the United States, leftist darling and supposedly progressive country China still has the death penalty. Do I hold this against China? Of course I do. I hold it against any government that has it. Did finding that out surprise me? No. I'm under no illusion that China is a leftist haven, because it's not. A 2022 article from Al Jazeera discusses reports on organ harvesting done on death row inmates before they were completely dead. A few clicks through that article leads to an Amnesty International report on global death penalty use, where the international human rights group makes the assertion that China has yet to publish any figures on the death penalty. However, available information indicates that each year, thousands of people are executed and sentenced to death. That same report talks about death sentences doled out in violation of international law. They say the death penalty was used for crimes that did not involve intentional killing and therefore did not meet the threshold of most serious crimes under international law. China is one of those countries that defied international law by handing it out for both drug-related and economic offenses. I wonder why in that interview in Global Times, an English-language Chinese propaganda outfit, in that interview over how it's totally unfair for people to critique Qatar's use of slavery and killing gay people, weird tanky Danny Haifong and law professor Wai Leiji went with so-called human rights record. I talked about this in a video discussing homophobic leftists. The idea is that human rights is a bourgeois concept used to push American hegemony. And so you totally should never critique anyone over how they treat their citizens. Okay, guys? China's bad record on gay rights, don't look at it. That's rainbow imperialism. That's pinkwashing, guys. Don't look too closely at how China embraces the death penalty and violates international law over it. Human rights don't exist, silly Billy. A post on the communism subreddit linked to a Business Insider article about a banker being sentenced to death for corruption. The comments are filled, of course, with people defending China's right to murder criminals. Will this work as a deterrent? Probably not, because there is no proof that the death penalty works as a deterrent, ever has, or ever will. Does it prevent more harm than life imprisonment? No, not at all. Unless the prison systems are literally torturous. What does it do? It lets the Chinese government portray itself as strong men who can determine and kill the bad guys. Those on the left in the US who are against the death penalty tend to understand that there's no exception you can make. Some of us arrive there from a morally, ethically principled position of murder is bad. Some arrive from the practical standpoint of giving the government the power to kill people inevitably means that innocent people will get murdered by the state, and that's bad. So why do some leftists say it's okay when China does it? People's Daily China tweeted out in 2022 that Fu Zhonghua received a death sentence for corruption. He used to be the Minister of Justice. In response, China shill Karja said, "I know many of you oppose death penalty in US, but hear me out," and then made a guillotine joke. Popular Twitter user Kyle Plant Emoji replied, Mr. Emoji has several tweets stating his opposition to the death penalty. Yet here he is, supporting it with a cute little laugh. People's Daily reports on these death sentences on their account, and pretty much each time you can find people in the comments and quote tweets with the hammer and sickle going, "Based!" Speaking of China and state murder, Mao killed a bunch of landlords. Here's a post in the socialist subreddit agreeing with that, and commenters calling for that to happen now. Here's one on the Communism 101 subreddit where some people are like, "Government didn't do it, the people did." While a bunch of others are like, "Yes, inspirational, we should do that now. We're totally serious about communism and aren't just edgy boys LARPing on the internet." Communism 101 also seems to think the death penalty is a good thing just in general. There's debate on the post-revolutionary state, but until communism is established, so, for the foreseeable future, communists should be getting some killing in. In a video where I talked about some leftists' obsession with the idea of inflicting harm on their opponents, I went over the case of the Romanovs, which people love to talk about because, high profile, rich people, revolution. People were like, "Hey, killing them was bad." You get the edgiest of edgy boys responding with, "Killing the kids was good, actually, and I would do the same thing, and it was their fault for being born into that family." In the comments to that video, someone tried to tell me that actually it's perfectly fine to happily fantasize about the villains of history getting sexually assaulted. How do you come to that conclusion? Well, by believing that actions are not good or bad by their nature. To assault someone isn't morally one way or the other, is the argument. What counts, instead, is if you do it against a good or a bad person. Yeah, that is morally repugnant, you're correct. It's a nonsensical argument. But Mr. Plant Emoji put it best when he said that actually it's good when bad things happen to bad people. Therefore, it makes sense when he's opposed to the death penalty in the US, but he gets the cutesy laugh when China hands it down. US bad, China good, billionaire bad. Therefore, China kill billionaire good. And speaking like that is how they gather support from people who do actually want a better world. Vast changes to the ways that we treat each other. But then you discover that these guys don't actually want it to change, not really. They just want to be the boot crushing the throats of people they hate. Some of them are arrogant enough to think that they will only ever hurt the so-called bad people, and that they are perfect at determining the bounds of what that means. Some don't give a shit about that. All that being said, wrapping it back around to the show, killing the Fire Lord. The argument that he deserved to die I find pointless. It's about retribution, which I don't think is a valid form of justice. It's evil. I'm sorry. It serves no purpose besides blood sport, and there is no reason to pretend that the spectacle of cruelty is a moral good. I'm not going to do it. I'm sorry. Spectacle of cruelty is just pure sadism. For the same reason, I reject the argument that it should have happened so Aang could get revenge for his people. You might recall how people brought up his character arc as a reason why he should have killed Ozai. But I don't think that tracks. I mean, you can make that argument from a literary standpoint, that's fine, but from the start of the show, we're shown that Aang holds great anger caused by his great pain. Understandable. And it's painted like he loses himself to the Avatar state because he needs to let go of the world to control it. But as Big Joel points out, that rock slam giving Aang that control back kind of derails that whole argument. Guru Patik was wrong. When Aang loses himself to the Avatar state, it's because he loses himself to his great anger. That is the metaphor going on here. He sees Gyatso's corpse. The Earthbenders threaten Katara. Appa vanishes. At the end of the show, he's presented with the avatar of his suffering. Pun intended. He beats Ozai's ass, and then he chooses to control himself and his anger. That moment is the culmination of Aang's growth, or at least It's one half of it. The other half of Aang's character arc has to deal with his refusal of his supposed destiny. Complainants say that from the start Aang is shown running away, and here too he ultimately evades his obligation. Not choosing to kill Ozai, they say, is him returning to who he was. But it's not. It's a simple storytelling technique, mirroring. You parallel the start, and doing so showcases the changes. Throughout the show and in Aang's backstory, we see how he is forced to not be a person. Aang is the Avatar. He has a destiny. He's not allowed to be Aang. He's not allowed to have needs and wants. He has a duty. When he originally flees, he accepts that he has no choice but to be what the world demands, and so he flees. But here, Aang says that he is Aang. He has the responsibility of his powers, but he is human. His thoughts and opinions and morals matter. He's an individual. He's not simply a tool of spiritual warfare. Aang rejects not his state of being the Avatar, but he rejects the mold that the world attempts to force him into as the Avatar. Morally speaking, he also makes the correct choice. With the appearance of the lion turtles, the writers actually do something really interesting in that they remove the fantasy from the dilemma. You could say energy bending makes Aang's decision too easy, but without it, isn't the decision too easy for us, the viewer? Theoretically, it's fun to think about how you would handle Ozai with his bending. I would still say killing him is wrong, but that's not what the show is interested in here. Without magic, Ozai is a man who has great political and monetary power, a man who has done great evil. And those types of men exist. They do, they have, and they will exist in our world. They haven't, don't, and won't possess magic. By taking away his bending, the show posits the question, is it moral for us, here in the real world, to kill evil people rather than imprison them? And the answer is no. It is not. And that's why the show takes away his bending. So we have to deal with the dilemma. Jet tries to get the gang to flood a village. If it weren't for Sokka, dozens of people would have died. Aang and Katara would have become mass murderers. And the resulting guilt, they would have collapsed in on themselves, spent the rest of their lives attempting to make up for it, and thereby paralleling Aang's mentality about the iceberg. Or they might have rationalized it. And rationalizing it so as to assuage their guilt, the duo would have had to lean into a version of Jet's ideology. If it weren't for Sokka, Jet could have swept in and guided them into being extremely violent revolutionaries. Having the Avatar going around nuking Fire Nation colonies would likely inspire deadly attacks from the oppressed peoples of the Earth Kingdom. And the resulting guerrilla warfare, the Fire Nation would increase its use of deadly force. But seeing an avenue for freedom through the roads paved by Aang's deadly campaign, there is a chance that the major cities of the Earth Kingdom would actually launch a heavy offensive. Seeing the Fire Nation start to struggle, the Northern Water Tribe might take advantage of that and launch an offensive from the north. A war is always going to be harder to fight on two fronts. Of course, there is a good chance that the Earth Kingdom and the Northern Water Tribe would not behave like that. The uprisings could fail. The two nations could be off-put by the degree of violence deployed. But there's a potential path to victory from Jet's plan. So if you believe that the ends always justify the means, you could maybe convince yourself of the morality of killing all those people. And in that case, I would recommend you to watch Code Geass. Lelouch is certainly an ends justify the means sort of dude, but if you don't achieve your end, does the idea of the ends justify the means? If you calculate the odds and they're not likely, does the small percentage justify the means? What if someone only pretends to care about the ends? What if their end is merely the means? That's not me saying that you shouldn't take risks when it comes to achieving a better future, but I think those are important questions to consider. And not a single one of them justifies killing innocent people. You can only manage that if, as that Marxism culturalism dude argues, you accept the whole settlers aren't civilians mindset and take that to such an extreme that incorporates children as well. There is a sort of logic there. Settler colonialism is built off and perpetuated by violence against the colonized. So if you make those arguments, you might start throwing around quotes from Frantz Fanon. The first mentions I ever saw of Fanon were on October 7th, 2020. His name came up again when I was looking into people's thoughts surrounding the film How to Blow Up a Pipeline. His name is a dude talking about violence, has a name that rhymes with cannon, and that would mean he is simply waiting to appear in a Hamilton-esque musical. Imagine the Lin-Manuel Miranda Fanon. A short video from Flickr Theory describes Fanon's observation that colonization systemically dehumanizes the colonized. Violent political ideologies, as far as I can tell, always invest in dehumanization. It's easy to intuit why. It's easier to brutalize, exploit, and not care about things and creatures than fellow people. Think of fascism's tendency to call people animals and infestations. When the Flickr Theory video said, according to Fanon, the oppressed regain their humanity through revolution and violence, I assumed this was politically speaking. When I was looking into some people's responses to Queen Elizabeth's death, I read a Michael Harriot article that pointed out how important it is to remind people that the oppressed do not enjoy their oppression. That is an assertion of humanity. But the Flickr video adds a Fanon quote that went against that assumption of political humanization. Violence frees the native from his inferiority complex and from his despair and inaction. It makes him feel less and restores his self-respect. So, violence is good because it makes the violent feel better psychologically. All respect to Fanon, but for the people who deploy that in defense of harming non-combatants, that is bullshit. No, it's not a valid defense. It's not a valid reason. We do not become human because of our bloodlust. It's one thing to show that as an observation of political goals or just an explanation of how the world tends to work. It's completely different to use it as a justification for why violence is fine, good, and should actually happen. But in actual respect to Fanon, I'm not so sure that that is a charitable interpretation of him. A Jacobin interview transcription has Peter Hudis saying that Sartre's preface to The Wretched of the Earth helps cement the Fanon idea, pun intended, that Fanon, capital F here, is an apostle of violence for its own sake. However, he says, that is not what Fanon was doing. He was accounting for the necessity of violence in specific moments of revolutionary struggle and in specific circumstances. I'm not convinced that that contradicts the implications of the Flickr Theory video. Violence for the sake of psychological catharsis and creation of self-respect. I'm not going to make an argument about what Fanon would think of killing civilians, but I can see how people might come to the conclusion that it's perfectly fine to use his arguments and observations to defend harming innocents and non-combatants. However, explanation is not the same thing as absolution. Jet was painted as wrong by the show because he was wrong. Cold utilitarianism or consequentialism as a defense for violent force against civilians is just an attempt at distancing from their bloodlust. What Jet wanted was an outlet for his anger. He wanted Fanon's catharsis. But catharsis is never a valid reason for harming someone, let alone murdering them. There's something to be argued for self-defense and certain exceptions in morality for combat. Most people, for instance, don't consider a soldier of one army shooting the soldier of another on the battlefield to be an example of killing. They wouldn't consider it murder, and so therefore it's not on the same moral level. I don't necessarily agree with that, but we can all understand the underlying idea that certain moral wrongs have moments where they don't qualify as wrong. Lying. We grew up hearing about its mores, but growing up and not being an asshole revolves figuring out that sometimes you lie out of kindness. One lesson that sexy nerd Chidi had to learn on The Good Place is that a strict Kantian moral philosophy with categorical imperatives can often lead to hurting people. Does that apply to murdering children? I'm sure if you want to play devil's advocate, you could come up with some conscious killing of a child that's defensible in some way, but their parents or grandparents did something bad. Is not one of those reason. A targeted attack on non-combatants is not morally defensible. The Marxism Culturalism video blamed the would-be deaths of those children on their parents, removing all moral culpability from Jet purposefully taking actions to murder those children. And yeah, sure, you can divvy up the blame that way. It is also complete bullshit. If you purposefully kill a kid and then go, well, their piece of shit parents brought them there, guess what? You still killed a kid, and you bear that responsibility. That does not humanize you. It does not grant you some holy catharsis. It just makes you a child murderer. But you gotta shift the blame. Why? Well, blame shifters are inherently insecure. Lots of people who advocate violence are inherently insecure about their advocation. But put a pin in that. Hama. Here's a question. When is torture acceptable? Is it A, when it's done by the CIA to supposedly gain knowledge in the war on terror? B, when perpetuated by Jack Bauer against whatever poor person comes in his sight? C, when it's done in hell against the bad people? D, when it's done as emotionally cathartic violence by the traumatized? Or E, when it's used as punitive punishment in a criminal justice system? If you answered any of the above, you got an F on the test, which is ironic because if you had answered F, never, you'd have passed with flying colors with bonus points for your rebellious nature. Sometimes when I've seen debates on bloodthirst from leftist revolution LARPers who gleefully talk about people getting the wall, and again, this is only some people, there's some version of a Nazi story spread around. After some advanced Googling on my part, I know, I'm very talented. It seems that story was put out there by Anthony Beaver. This is how it goes according to Victor Mattis at the Hoover Institution. His young SS soldier forced to play a piano for his Russian captors. They made it clear in sign language that he would be executed the moment he stopped. The man played for 22 hours, after which he collapsed in tears. The Russians congratulated him and then shot him. Did this actually happen? Who knows? Probably no one cares. What is the goal of people sharing it? It's not generally shared to showcase Russian brutality or force us to reckon with the ways we treat enemy combatants. The idea seems to be, this dude is evil, he's a Nazi. Good point, that is correct. Therefore, his torture is #based. Terrible point, complete misunderstanding of morality, incorrect. But people are generally, thankfully, wired to be anti-Nazi. Many people are then fine with harming them. When I've seen it brought up, the rhetorical goal is to get people to say, yeah, you know, that's fine. And then for the person bringing it up to go, so you agree that it's moral to kill the bad people? And the trick they think they're playing is if you say, torture is bad, then they can accuse you of being pro-Nazi, like that is somehow how logic works. It's not. When is torture moral? The answer is never. You can probably build up some thought experiment, some edgy trolley problem, but not once will a successful edgy boy trolley problem make the torture for cathartic or punitive reasons is fine case. There is even an edgy boy torture thought experiment called the ticking bomb scenario. Basically, you've got someone you know without a doubt has placed a bomb, knows where it is, and how to disable it. The only way to get that information out of him is via torture. And if you don't, people will die. Is that permissible? The problem with this thought experiment, as Naif Al-Waran points out, is the science doesn't support the idea that torture is remotely effective in accurate information gathering. To correctly torture someone likely also requires systemic support for torture, including torture training. That's not to mention that in the criminal justice system, proven to have done it is often a label slapped on entirely innocent people who have not done it. The point of the thought experiment isn't to deal with the real world, not really. It's a test of one's personal boundaries and how they weigh suffering and acceptable behavior. If you want to be true to it, the fact that it can't function in the real world could maybe even be the point. And also, that would be how you distinguish it from the trolley problem, which does, unfortunately, have real world analogs. Here in the real world, torture would not save the people in the ticking bomb problem because torture does not work. The very premise of that problem, though, relies on the idea that torture by and of itself is wrong. To find permissible outlets for it, you have to compare it to other horrible things in a binary choice. You're weighing it against to see which is the less moral decision. Bringing it back to Avatar: The Last Airbender, Hama. Remember that old lady who invented bloodbending? Very cool of her. When Team Avatar arrives in her locale, Toph hears screaming beneath the mountains. They eventually discover the Fire Nation civilians imprisoned there. Hama's bloodbending only works during a full moon. People disappear during full moons here. This has been ongoing. Some of these prisoners have likely been there for months. They are the ones screaming beneath the mountains. Are the shouts only from new prisoners desperate for someone to hear them? Or is it torture? It seems like the widely understood notion is that Hama was torturing these people, similar to how she was tortured by Fire Nation prison guards after being captured at the South Pole. When Aang, Toph, and Sokka find these prisoners, we see the villagers chain with their hands above their heads. That pose is eventually going to cause chafing, bruising, and lacerations around the wrists from the cuffs. The blood will drain out of your fingertips, your palms, and your arms. Your heart is going to have trouble pumping blood to your extremities. They'll tingle at first, pins, needles, buzzing, bees in your veins. You might focus on the ache in your arms, but the pins eventually beg for attention. It goes from needles to glass, bees to wasps. Normally, when the winter chill comes, the bugs die out, but as your fingers start to freeze from the lack of blood flow and oxygen, the bugs stay. They stab. The code becomes fire, but even that can't get rid of the bugs. Your knees get weak, but if you start to fall, your shoulders strain, they might pop out. You must stand. Wasn't that fun to imagine? Go back and watch the blood-bending scenes. See how the body moves? It's not in any natural sort of way. It contorts and contracts, twists and spins. Not only do you experience the psychological torture of being a prisoner within your own body, you get the physical torture of those movements. It looks like you're gonna get broken bones and bruises, trauma to organs. Hama tortured some folks. A lot of talk around Hama focuses on a similar moral linchpin as Jet's attempted mass murder, the emotional catharsis of violence. She is filled with anger, righteous anger, at the pain caused to her and her people, and this is an outlet for her against people nominally related to those who harmed her. Not the actual people who harmed her, not against soldiers, just mostly civilians. But her humanity was taken away. So to humanize herself, she has to partake in this violence. Am I making that point sound stupid? I hope I am, because it is. Bloodthirst is never an excuse. Anger is not this holy emotion beyond critique that people want to pretend it is. Harm done to you does not excuse the harm you do unto others. We are all creatures with free will, and we choose how we behave. Hama did not torture these people because she had no choice but to due to what was done to her. She tortured them because she wanted to. She chose to. That makes a bad person. Or to be less reductive, a person who does terrible things. Think of the fire and brimstone version of Christian hell. Sinners are cast down into eternal torment for their crimes on earth, or more specifically, not belonging to the specific brand of Christianity that the people telling them they're going to get tortured for belong to. A lot of people who gleefully talk about what they hope happens to people in hell are speaking about cathartic sadism. Some, however, view this as a form of justice. The bad people deserve to be harmed. torture doesn't need to have a positive impact in their minds. Torture is justified when it is punishment for bad behavior. It's the same justification they use for why they should be allowed to deploy the death penalty when they are in power, because they'll deploy it against people who have done bad things, deserve it as punishment for the actions they did. Their entire concept of justice is merely sadism. Retributive justice is itself immoral. I'm sorry, you'll grow out of it. People get bogged down here in the arguments over Hama and say that she was wrong because she targeted innocent civilians, which, I mean, yeah, she did do that, and that does make her actions wrong, but she could have had a bunch of Ozais trapped down there, and torturing them would still be wrong. Why, though, does the guilt of the tortured weigh on whether or not some consider their torture to be moral? Torture is categorically wrong. But if you twist the ideas of, say, oppressor-oppressed dynamics, you, ironically enough, dehumanize the oppressor and all those related to them. As Al Radhan points out, torture is much easier to commit if you dehumanize the victims. You don't engage your empathy as deeply when dealing with non-human entities. At the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you saw a lot of people wandering towards dehumanizing language and metaphors to Russian people at large. Following the start of Israel's deadly actions in Gaza, anti-Semitism has been clearly on the rise. There have been people who defend the Houthi slogan that says, "A curse upon the Jews," by saying that with Israel nearby doing what it does, of course the Houthis are going to be anti-Semitic. There's this idea that if you can explain something, it becomes defensible. But that's not how this works. Plenty of bigotry is based in trauma that doesn't put it beyond critique. It doesn't make it a good thing to hold, or a just thing, or a defensible thing. Bigotry is inherently dehumanizing. That's the entire purpose of it. And dehumanization is always how you justify atrocity, which I guess means it is time for the next book in the series. Book 4. Politics! As mentioned in book 2 of this ridiculously long video, the criticism of how the show handles violence is often about its quote-unquote liberalism. There are people who wholeheartedly defend the actions of Hama and Jet from a sort of pro-violence, no-holds-barred sort of thing. Then there are others who say that those two do their worst actions because of the anti-resistance politics of the writers. The claim is that the show is anti-violence. And no offense to those people who claim that, but that is bad media comprehension. Team Avatar stages a prison revolt with a bunch of earthbenders, smash several Fire Nation airships out of the air, many of them with soldiers inside said ships, participate in a targeted invasion against the Fire Nation capital during a day where firebenders are at their weakest, aim to assault and capture the heads of the Fire Nation, actively fight and imprison both Ozai and Azula, destroy what amounts to a Fire Nation religious temple, participate in what seems to be an illegal fighting ring, fight against a secret police in Ba Sing Se, do a bit of eco-terrorism, start a prison riot to initiate a second prison break, and the entire time are participating in a war. These things are presented positively. Violence as self-defense is frequent in the show. Bending is a beautiful extension of martial arts, which the show takes heavy pains to showcase as not just useful but awe-inspiring. Violence, the show says, can be art. It can be good. Outside of the gang, the White Lotus retakes Ba Sing Se in a display of heavy violence. Roku is painted as a failure for having too much mercy. Kyoshi is painted as correct for having killed Shin the Conqueror. Zhao's death is maybe a bit tragic, sure, but it's also painted as cosmic justice for both his actions and his whole deal. Everyone who isn't named Aang is like Hey, killing the firebender would be the right thing to do here, buddy. Gyatso takes out a whole host of Fire Nation soldiers, and only his death is looked at as a tragedy in the instance. With Hama, while her breakout might be horrifying, you aren't meant to view her in a negative light until you find out that she is harming innocents. What she did to her captors, the show says, might be gross, but fine. To say the show is anti-violence and anti-resistance is to just not engage at all with the content. It's to not read the text. Or more accurately, it's to lie about the content for political reasons. By pretending that the show is wholesale anti-violence allows you to paint any violence that is not maximally destructive, not fine with killing non-combatants or being anti-death penalty, anti-torture, and any of that is to be entirely pro-oppression. Now, putting a few seconds of thought into that makes that clearly not the case. But if you're an extremist whose only complaints about the boots pressing down on people is that the wrong people have shoes, doing this sort of non-media analysis can help you. It can also gain you social points with fellow edgy big boys on the internet, the dirtbag chapo types. Say, even, you might want to do a revolution. There's a lot of critique of media that comes down to, I don't like that this trope exists, and I think it's inherently invalid. How many people complain about stories that end with, it was all a dream, for instance? I could go on and on about how that can actually be an excellent ending with brilliant existentialism that makes you ask fantastic questions. If there's one trope, though, that comes close to the level of demonization that it was all a dream gets, it's the, then they kicked a puppy. Or at least, it approaches that controversy with certain types of online left spectrum peeps. What you'll often see is people complaining that this trope is deployed by Hollywood and our corporate overlords to stop us from fixing the world. And by fixing the world, they normally mean doing a glorious revolution. Therefore, of course, using the trope makes you at best a liberal, well, scary, or a reactionary. The artist and art protector in me finds that criticism childish, insulting, and reactionary itself. I'm not against critiquing things or tropes, but I am entirely against the idea that art becomes worthless or evil or bad because it uses any trope. And the idea that culture is only a method of control is some evangelical Christian we are not of the world, isolationist cult building idiotic bullshit. It's not how you build an effective movement. Stop it, you fucking morons. These people have a point, but they go too far. Or to put it another way, these people have a point, but then they kicked a puppy, so you know that they're the bad guy. Part of the problem here is a grade school level understanding of literature. Good guy versus bad guy is not the same thing as protagonist versus antagonist. An antagonist can be the most moral person in a story and still be the antagonist because they oppose the protagonist. And the text might point towards the protagonist as being in the right. What really lies at the core of the hatred for this trope isn't the delegitimization of rightful critique. Killmonger's accusations against Wakanda weren't wrong because dude was a murderous psychopath. Coin wanting to restart the Hunger Games with capital children didn't make the resistance against the capital itself wrong. Deadeye being a genocidal shit didn't make the Danan uprising against the Renans wrong. Sometimes, yeah, the trope is deployed as a way of saying, these beliefs are inherently radicalizing, stay away. But isn't it mostly just a critique of a thing that happens? The critique of Coin in the Hunger Games isn't that rebelling against oppressors is bad. The critique is that cathartic revenge is bad. Populism is bad. But because we think bad guy when we think antagonist, when we see extremists morally wrong actions taken by antagonistic groups with legitimate grievances, we assume the text is calling them the bad guy. And that's troubling because the bad guys are supposed to be all bad. To have legitimate grievances and still act in horrid ways means horrid actions are morally wrong, and that people of any persuasion might commit horrid actions. That they are, in fact, committed by people and not monsters. Think back to that Nazi torture story. When it's told as a lol-based type thing, the idea is that the Nazism dehumanizes the man to the point where we can now enjoy torture and bask in sadism. They can turn their empathy off. We want the bad guys to be monsters, not humans. That way we can more easily enjoy their pain. I watched the first couple of seasons of Netflix's 13 Reasons Why adaptation when I was in college. In it, football player Bryce sexually assaults people. At first, he's just evil. Bully asshole with charisma, stock character type. But then the show starts to humanize him in the following seasons. I remember at the time people being outraged at this redeeming a rapist? How dare we? But here's the thing, is that what it was doing? Or was it saying that Bryce wasn't this monster high school stock character? He was just a guy. He had nice moments, he had cruel moments. He was a person, and he did something horrific. The point to humanizing the villains is to remind us that there are no monsters. There are only people. We tend to imagine that we ourselves are not capable of such horrific things. The people that we love and trust are not capable of such horrific things. The people we agree with are not, because we are human. Our enemies, those monsters, they lack the humanity needed to not do the bad things. Except they are human, and we are capable of being cruel. Of the 3 people who have done similar things to me as Bryce did, I only know one of them. And while I think he's generally a bit annoying, I wouldn't call him a monster. He just did something awful. But dehumanizing him would only make him into something bigger. Something, a creature I could justify wishing sadistic harm upon, but I don't do that. He is a person, and people do shitty things, even our political allies. But we cannot abide by the idea of our ideological partners being shown as antagonists, sympathetic or not, because then we would have to recognize that the bad guys are still just guys, people. And suddenly we might not be able to dehumanize our own enemies so easily. A lack of dehumanization makes it harder to commit violence. Dehumanization lessens the empathy felt for the dehumanized. That lessened empathy makes it easier psychologically to inflict harm. If you take that dehumanization away, sadism suddenly gets a lot less fun. And if your political LARP online is all about being cruel to other people, taking the fun out of sadism defeats the purpose of the whole shindig. Jet and Hama are tragic characters. They've been put through incredible amounts of pain, suffering, and loneliness. They're filled with understandable anger. Part of them wants to help their people. Part of them wants to be free of the burden of their anger. Part of them wants the supposed catharsis of sadism, a thing that doesn't actually exist. That third one is what destroys them, and this isn't without real-world parallels. The Russian czars were bad. Monarchy is bad. Killing the Romanov children and desecrating their corpses before tossing them into unmarked graves? Also bad. Lincoln fighting against slavery? Fucking great. Lincoln giving a middle finger to habeas corpus? Bad. Defeating Imperial Japan? Good. Vaporizing civilians with a doomsday bomb? Bad. You could go on and on with this sort of thing. You can do it in reverse too and look at the good things done by people primarily known for their horrors. I made a video talking about the TikTok brainworms that is the Starbucks Palestine boycott. The boycott is largely based on falsehoods, and people get very, very angry when you point this out or critique them in any way, shape, or form about this, even if you are also pro-Palestinian. One of the comments I got on that video decided, for some reason, to defend 9/11 as a sort of way of defending 10-7. The idea in that comment was that both US and Israel have committed atrocities, and therefore killing civilians was understandable and maybe even warranted. I deleted that comment. I am not going to entertain your bloodlust or give you a platform for it. I also deleted comments calling for the ethnic cleansing of Israelis. People can rage at me all they want for that shit because they're angry over being told their boycott is based on a lie. That's fine. But you can sincerely fuck off with any LARPish sadistic bullshit. But I bring that up here because that 9/11 comment was doing something similar to this trope everyone complains about. There were legitimate grievances against the US for our policies in the Middle East. The idea then of this comment is that because there is something there, then their actions are justifiable and good. But no, they aren't. Bad actions are bad actions. It doesn't matter who commits them or who they are committed against. Killing civilians is always wrong. It is wrong when Israel does it. It is wrong when Al-Qaeda does it. It is wrong when Hamas does it. And it is wrong when the US does it. Despite what the Red Star Caucus of DSA might say, a group fighting for liberation does not absolve them of all of their wrongdoing. You can only argue that if your political goals require dehumanization of your enemies, so you can inflict violences upon them and say that that is fine because they deserve it. This critique of Avatar, that its handling of Jed and Hama and Ozai comes from an anti-liberation, anti-violence, pro-oppression, neoliberal, right dude bro space, is, in my opinion, cope. And it's entirely based on the insecurity of violence. But before we can get to that, we do have to address the Bosco's just a bare elephant in the room. Book 5, Children's Media. Avatar: The Last Airbender is a children's cartoon. In the first section, I blathered on about how that doesn't mean you can't mine it for depth, and I stand by that. All art is an ocean that goes as deep as you are willing to dive. But we can't ignore what it is when talking about how it handles its content. Here's a question for you. What is Avatar: The Last Airbender even about? Break it down to its absolute core. What is this show? It's tempting when you're older to say it's about war, but is it? A war happens, that's part of the plot. There's a lot of fighting, but is it about fighting? Is it about magic? No. There's a Spider-Man with great power vibe going on with Aang's chosen oneness, but is that what it's about? Not really. Maybe secondarily, but I would say that would have to at least be tertiary. When people talk about wanting a dark take on the show, they're already admitting something. It's a light show. It is bathed in the light, in hope. I would posit that Avatar: The Last Airbender, in super simple terms, is truly about how to keep hold of yourself and your joy in the face of hardship. The beauty of Aang as a character is that he's a goofy kid. He likes having fun and making jokes. He is amazed by the world. He searches for the good any chance he gets. Avatar's a fun show. It's a funny show. For all the drama and sad moments, there are a million more smiles. The fights are dances, but sometimes there are slapstick dances. Aang's lowest moments are when he loses himself. He loses to fear and to anger. He loses sight of himself when he's pursuing not who he is as Aang the person or Aang the avatar, but as the avatar who is currently named Aang. Toph is sarcastic and gruff and violent, but she's filled with wonder and joy and love. Katara grew up way too fast, and she has a hell of a lot of repressed anger. But she is filled with empathy and love. She cares for people. She wants to help them. Sokka is untrusting and longing to prove himself, but he's insane and curious and filled with wonder. Zuko is traumatized and scarred and pushed by supposed destiny, but he just wants to be loved. He's goofy and awkward and tries too hard. Aang meeting the lion turtle and learning energy building was the only way the show was ever going to end. Lion turtle or elsewise, he was never going to kill Ozai. That's not because of Nickelodeon censors. I mean, partially, but because killing him would be going against the whole point of the show. It would be destroying Aang in order to be the Avatar. It would be saying that your innocence and hope must be dashed. But the entirety of Avatar firmly rejects that idea. Aang's innocence and hope and childishness are his greatest strengths. Jet is there to show that if the gang killed their innocence, they would end up killing civilians. If they could not find joy in all of their stupid little adventures, they would do horrible things. Do not lose yourself to anger. Zuko's character arc is learning how to find himself after being lost to his anger and pride. Aang's character arc is about learning how not to lose himself. This isn't a show about defeating the bad guy or defeating the bad things. It's about making sure that you survive. You and your joy are needed to make a better world. That is the show. But it's also important to keep in mind that you're showing this to kids. Are kids in the United States likely to be under the impressive thumb of an invading genocidal empire? No. Are there any 12-year-olds out there likely to lead a successful revolution? No. Have you met 12-year-olds? Ugh. You take these lessons and you apply them to what is applicable in your own life. 7-year-olds are dealing with schools and family. Some, yes, do deal with a lot worse. But if you make a kid's show about how you have to kill the bad guy, that might be a bad lesson when the majority of the audience is going to see the bad guy as the kid who pushed them on the playground. So for Hama and Jet to be portrayed as right, for Ozai to have died, this would not only have to probably be made for a different age demographic, but it would fundamentally have to be a different show at its very core. Hama and Jet are lessons that align firmly within the show's themes. Their tragedy is tragic because they are not the bad guys. So we've talked about the critiques. I've given my critiques of the critiques. But there's still one question left. Why is it that arguments keep getting hashed out over Avatar: The Last Airbender on end forever and ever, amen? Part of it is nostalgia and recent adaptation, people rewatching or watching for the first time and wanting to discuss things they noticed. But that's not everything. Why do we keep talking about violence in Avatar? Book 6, The Insecurity of Violence. I made a long video over the censorship of NSFW content both online and in art in general. In it, I made some brief comments poking fun at certain leftists who go on about the revolution they long for that's not actually coming. Plenty of people have pointed out how for certain types of left-leaning people, the revolution is just a secular version of the rapture. Sometimes those types coincide with the same ones who are anti-woke but leftistly. They cling to the idea of hell, torment, and karmic justice where the bad guys will be violently punished in retribution. They're basically just conservative evangelical Christians who found the religious label to cringe for them, but they didn't want to discard the underlying beliefs. A commenter asked who I was talking about because he didn't have any experience with those types. After I responded, this person basically said, well, as a college-educated white dude, I don't think it's my place to tell oppressed people how to act. I don't want to take anything off the table for them. No disrespect, but what a cowardly bullshit answer that is. There are, I think, two types of ways to interpret the first section of the comment. It could have been a dig at me. You know, I'm also a college-educated white guy. I have a degree, a theater degree, laugh all you want. In the grand scheme of things, I'm quite privileged. Fair critique, I suppose. That may have been his way of saying, you being anti-violence is a bit yikesies, my guy. Don't you know sadistic fantasy is fine? The second interpretation is that he's using his proximity to privilege to dodge the question. Notice how that wasn't a statement on whether he finds heavy violence acceptable, or what kinds he would approve of, or if he wants revolution, or any comment actually about his personal morals, politics, or ethics. Why? Because to make a statement on any of that would be putting a personal stake in the game. He's either not okay with sadistic violence, or he is, and he knows that that is shameful, so he avoids saying it. On May 24th, the Red Star Caucus of the Democratic Socialists of America published a statement pushing against condemnations of the terrorist group Hamas. Red Star's argument is that because Hamas is part of the resistance that exists, condemning them while being pro-Palestine is being idealist. It's effectively doing nothing but making yourself feel good. To which I say, if that is what your materialism leads you to, fuck your materialism. To say you're not allowed to condemn the killing of civilians? For the better part of the past century, Western media has shaped the story of Israel and Palestine into one where Israel, the settler colonial aggressors, are victims of the indigenous resistance. This phenomenon has deeply shaped how Americans view the situation. DSA members are not immune to that, and this type of propaganda has been very effective in making people hesitant to support Palestinian resistance. By Palestinian resistance, they do mean Hamas here. The graphic at the top of their article says, "Do you commend Hamas? Ooh, aren't they the good boys? Tell them they're good boys." They recommend Al Jazeera as a good source for info. To quote Al Jazeera, early on October 7th, Hamas fighters stormed communities along Israel's southern fence with Gaza. At least 1,139 people, mostly civilians, were killed in the attack. Another news organization the article supports, who I do not, Electronic Intifada, says in an article critiquing CNN anchor Dana Bash that when she claimed 1,200 civilians were killed, that was about 300 too many, which means that Electronic Intifada thinks 900 civilians were killed. 900 out of 1,200 is 75% civilian casualties. Oh, except, they also say 75 more were foreigners. That is 81% non-combatants killed. Do we need to commend Hamas for carrying out an entirely ineffective operation where 8 out of every 10 killed were not acceptable targets? No. Commend suggests uncritical support. It suggests celebration. To critique would destroy the entire resistance is the implication of this article from Red Star. If resistance cannot withstand critique against the mass murder of civilians, then it is incredibly fragile and it has no future, which is depressing, isn't it? Their article suggests that if you do not support Hamas, you support imperialism, capitalism, and the boot pressing down on oppressed peoples everywhere. To critique them is to be the enemy. That's pretty hyperbolic. So why do they say that? An October 12th joint statement by Red Star and Mug laments a statement they suggested DSA put out and the edits the DSA then made. They hopefully offer both statements for comparison. The main difference between the two statements is an added second paragraph that states, "We abhor attacks on innocent Palestinians and Israelis and mourn the death of all those who have already been killed." No such similar language appears in the statement suggested by those caucuses. Put together with their "we commend Hamas" moment, it seems as if Red Star is in support of the attacks on Israeli civilians and thinks that their deaths are acceptable, in my opinion. Read through their documents for yourself. When the Mormonovs come up for discussion, another one of those constantly recurring discourses, people get very defensive when you suggest killing the kids was bad. But the material conditions. We're talking morality and philosophy here. The point of critique is so that we, now, here, can be better. But people often assume any critique is destructive. It's a childish black and white morality. It assumes major fragility. If you suggest nuance, you're suggesting that they might be the bad guys. Because these types of people are so insecure, they cannot imagine themselves as holding any shades of gray without falling into heavy despair. When people say that Avatar is against violence, they are lying. They're not engaging with the text of the show almost at all. But the idea there is that you have to support all excesses they might want to engage in. If you don't support all of their violent urges, then you don't support them in any capacity. To say that murder and torture are bad is to say those who want to do those things are bad. And they can't stand to feel like maybe their anger is immoral. anger is inherently fragile. A politics based in anger is inherently insecure. Facts are rejected and feed the anger because they suggest that anger might be misplaced. And that critique, that it might be misplaced, might destroy the entire movement in their minds. At least that's the fear. When you say that, no, Starbucks does not support genocide, some people get very pissed off because they are incredibly emotionally invested in the idea that it does. It doesn't matter if they're wrong. It is an outlet for their immense anger. And to say that it's a waste of their energy that could be better spent actually helping the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause feels as if you are saying the entire cause is a waste of energy. Now, obviously that doesn't logically flow, but to riff off a popular phrase on the right, facts might not care about your feelings, but feelings don't care about your facts either. Just as desire is desire for desire, anger often exists to perpetuate itself. When we critique movements, actions, people, what are we doing? Are we attempting to make ourselves feel better, or are we attempting to inoculate ourselves against our worst instincts? I like to think it's the second one. So yes, the actions of the oppressed are subject to critique. Actions can be good or bad. Harming civilians is a morally negative act regardless of the team of the person who does the harm. The Fire Nation harming civilians is a moral wrong. Jet aiming to harm civilians is a moral wrong. Capital punishment is a moral wrong. It does not matter if the US government or some magical future communist utopia is the one doing it. It does not matter if the person sentenced is innocent or guilty. The death penalty itself is a wrong action. When people say, it's not my place to critique the actions of the oppressed, when the actions are harming civilians, they're just completely sidestepping the question. When people defend the anti-Semitism of the Houthis, or Jet wanting to flood a village, or Hama torturing civilians, when they get angry at those who do critique those things, they're expressing their insecurity. Why? Because they do support those actions, but they feel shame for that support. Red Star's statements avoid talking about the deaths of innocent Israelis because the very concept makes them insecure. Avatar continues to roll through the same discourse cycles because the pro-violence people are insecure. They cannot handle being critiqued for their bloodlust. Even more specifically, what they really cannot bear is to be told not to lose themselves to their anger because they want to bury themselves in that anger. Because maybe, a bit counterintuitively, anger is easy. It gets you a lot of social credit on the internet. You play the angry radical for other angry radicals. You talk about how being against killing civilians is liberal bullshit while ginning up the supposed revolution and how you're stick it to the bad guys and get your bloody justice because you are despairing. And unfortunately, the supposed catharsis of violence has never filled the pits of despair. It can't. He's supposed to be immortal. No. Don't touch me. I asked so little. I said do not leave. When you did, I hid the way. I bristled, begged you help me please. Then you go and wait until my nightmares drip into the day. This treasure's now a worthless one, as useless as a setting sun. Now with the stars and moon as witnesses, tell me how could you do this to me? I had to throw this cursed treasure chest into the sea. No. Oh, Ezra, you're in love. That's so sweet. I guess love to you means leaving someone in the cold to grieve. Mom, please. And Wisty, dear. You are so brave, brave enough to place me 1 foot in the grave with how you misbehave. He was my chance, my only chance, the only shot to win this dance between the living and the dead. I let my hope go to my head, and now it's gone. I have failed. All I can and sees the setting sun, and I am scared. I am scared. What good is a queen whose promises don't mean a thing? How could you do this to me? We're sorry. We love you. Mom? Mom? I'm not your mom. I am human. I am a queen. I'm no mother to you filthy muds, you bastions of hard luck, you flea-infested Mongol kind, you wolves are all the same inside, ungrateful monsters through and through.